I think if you are not getting what you want from your teams as a manager, you have failed to lead appropriately. You haven't created the conditions to be able to delegate into that team. So I'm Dennis Stevens. I'm the chief methodologist of a company called Leading Agile. You know, the genesis for this talk is around, we go into a lot of organizations and we hear a lot of times management won't let us form these teams well, or we don't know how to empower teams. And you look at the literature that's out there. I was reading an article recently in HBR about empowering teams. And the very first line in the step of the 5 steps, how do you empower your teams, was manage your teams in an empowered way. Like, what the heck does that even mean? Like, what does it mean to go empower teams? I think there's an interesting challenge in our industry too, that the Agile community for a long time has been fighting to be allowed to be empowered, but we don't understand what must be in place to empower teams. Like, why would I trust a team that can't do what they say they're going to do? Right? Why would I put my credibility and my job on the line as a leader in an organization and just give the team everything they need and just trust them to get stuff done? Like, there's some sort of a bargain, some sort of conditions we have to strike to make this be a healthy relationship. Does that make sense? So I think that we don't pay attention to that all the time. So what I've been doing is, as I'm talking about this with clients and as I'm going to different places and talking with people, I'm going to share with you some of how I've been getting people to see both sides of the coin of that. What does it take to empower teams? And hopefully you walk out of here with a little bit of a set of questions that you can shape for your own purposes, where you see it not working, to walk in and go, now why is this not working? Because it's probably not that the manager is deliberately trying to make everybody in the organization fail, or trying to undermine the health of everybody, and you know, they're just that's not what's happening, right? And the teams, they want to be given the rights to make decisions and do work the way they want to do it. But what would have to be true for that relationship to work well? Is that a good topic? Interesting. So that's what it said in the piece of paper. You all showed up, so I assumed you'd like the topic. The slides are going to be available if you go to 33777 and just text managers. You'll get the slides. What I want to talk about here is the conversations that we have to navigate through with management to get them to empower our teams. How many people in here are managers and want to understand how to empower their teams? How many people are consultants or team members that feel like managers don't know how to empower their teams? Yeah. So why is it important to empower teams? Like, why do we need to actually give teams empowerment? Why do we need to move decisions closer to the work surface? So that's a topic, but I think it's important. We all know, it's just kind of Scrum, Agile, the whole world knows that if we have to escalate every decision, it just takes forever. And then the people making the decisions don't have the nuanced craft understanding, the foo in place to make the decisions they need to make, right? So we want decisions to be made within empowered teams if we possibly can, so we can move at the speed that we need to. Everybody agree with that? Why is it hard to empower teams? Like, why is it necessary? What does it mean? Why is it hard? We're going to talk about why it's hard. And then I'm going to give you 3 strategies, actually 4 strategies to build systems to ensure the right attributes are in place to empower your teams. As a group, I just ask a couple questions. Why is it hard for managers to empower teams? They want control. Why do they want control? Fear? What are they afraid of?
Losing.
Oh, you think it's a win-lose? You think it's all about winning?
Big part.
You think it's about winning?
Yes.
Okay. Why do they want to win?
Ego.
Fascinating. That's an interesting path. I would suggest that is not the healthiest path to take that conversation down. I would suggest that if we start out believing that the managers and organizations have bad aspirations to win at all costs at everybody else's expense, this is a really hard conversation to have, right? And so, if you're showing up that way and that's the conversation you're having, you're not going to get the collaboration with the management that you need to move forward. How many of the managers in the room feel like that you're here just to win at all costs, exploit everybody, just burn people to the ground? Just raise your hands up on that one. How about if I started the conversation with that? You know, the way you're leading, just to soothe your ego and win at all costs, just to burn the place down? Let's talk about that, because I need you to change your ego. What do you think? It's not going to go well, is it? Managers, why are you afraid to empower your teams? What are the challenges with empowering teams? Why does it not happen?
Trust.
Trust. Fascinating. trust. So I need to be able to give the team things to do and have them deliver in a way that is still safe for everybody. Because I'm kind of responsible for the people looking at me for making sure that dollars are spent well, that outcomes get achieved. It's a reasonable place to be, right? So you're not just trying to win at all costs? No? Okay. But it's interesting because it feels that way when we can't have healthy conversations, right? And I think that the Agile industry, to a certain extent, has promoted that, just empower the teams and get out of the way. I think the servant leadership coaching world has talked about just be there for your teams and support them. And I'm a huge advocate of Agile teams and empowering teams. I'm a huge advocate of servant leadership and taking care of your teams. Let's talk about, like, why is that really hard to get to? And some of the things that industry has tried to do to solve for those and maybe why they don't work. But team empowerment happens when a group of employees has the responsibility and authority to make decisions. Everybody good with that? All right. So if we look at things like Agile and Waterfall, these are methods of operating in organizations that are kind of well known. And I'm using Waterfall as a little bit of a straw man, but just bear with me on that. But basically, Agile, small teams working together close to the surface, making decisions in real time. Agile is really good for solving problems that have a high level of ambiguity, but it's not great when there's a lot of dependencies. You guys okay with that? Okay. So we put Agile in place where there's a lot of ambiguity, and what gets away from us is the dependencies. How many of y'all work in organizations that have no dependencies? Like end to end can just ship stuff to your customer after talking to the customer. Okay, so there's some challenges with we have to do something to figure that out. What Waterfall attempts to do, Waterfall is really good at managing dependencies, interdependencies, but in order for that to work, we have to know everything about it up front. How many of y'all work in industries or are solving problems where you can know everything about the work up front and have no variation, how to do it or what problem you're solving? So this is the problem, right? It's kind of a cool, like, that's really clear on the problem. So how can I trust a team? Is at the point that a team does something, they've decided what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. Does that make sense? At the point in time that a team operates, there's not a lot of ambiguity or not a lot of interdependencies. They're actually managing in the moment of action, right? So this is why Agile teams work, and it's also why we actually want Agile teams in big waterfall, big complex projects, because we need those teams to be able to operate close to the surface. We can make that bottom box bigger with some technologies and some expertise, some experience. It might be smaller in some cases if we're outsourcing things. You know, so there's like different, that box can kind of shape. But does this picture make sense to y'all? So the goal is, how do we create the conditions for teams to make decisions and be able to perform work in a trustworthy manner? Good call. Right, he already read the deck. Right, so the goal is as managers, how do we make that happen? And it's a collaborative thing. It's not a one-way street. You with me? So the problem is the problems we're solving are up in that big green box. And the avenue for solving this problem is in between high ambiguity, high interdependency problems and the point of execution. And what I'm going to talk about a little bit is that we need to figure out how to solve that and come up with an intentional plan. Do we solve it by putting in specific practices in place, like Scrum of Scrums or dependency boards, or like that's a set of practices? Y'all okay with that? Do we solve it with a culture? Just trust the team, stand back, let people figure it out. They'll self-organize, they'll figure it all out, right? Now, practices are critical, and culture is core to being able to operate in new methods, right? We have to change the way that we think about things. But our belief is in order to change that, we actually have to get the systems in place. And a system is a group of interacting and interrelated elements that act according to a set of rules to form a unified whole. So those Scrum teams don't operate as an independent agent when there's dependencies, right? And the people asking for stuff don't operate as an independent group when they're operating in the complex organizations that we're in. So we have to think about it like systemically. We have to get the teams to do some things different, get management to do some things different. There's probably a more complex layering of concepts we can get into, but in 45 minutes, I'm going to go through just some basic core things about what are the attributes of how we solve for that problem. We got to be able to clarify the intent and cast vision so the team knows what it's operating within. We can't expect the team to invent its own clarity. That's a failure mode. It's in a lot of organizations. We don't sufficiently address where are my gaps in clarity. We have to be able to clarify the path forward, aligning the competence and capacity of the teams doing work with what we need. So sometimes we ask teams to do things that they have to figure out, or we give them 10 times too many things to do and then expect them to be trustworthy, right? Do any of y'all have teams that are working on 10 times more things than they have capacity to do? Does that happen a lot? So if we're doing that as leaders, if we're putting that burden on the organization, how can we expect that team to be trustworthy in its production? Like, we're creating the conditions that the team can't be trustworthy, right? So one of the things that Scrum tries to do to solve that is they give us a capacity, they give us a velocity. We say they control the velocity, we'll help them with the backlog, right? So that's a way that we try to create balanced capacity. And then we have this sprint planning where we balance out the competence. This is gonna be hard, this is gonna be easy, and we have them commit to things they understand, right? So Scrum kind of tries to address that a little bit. And teams have a cadence where they're operating with intent, but within constraints. So those are the sort of the attributes. Those are the attributes of solving from that problem up there. And if you'll notice, I put another team up in the upper box. I think this concept of stacking of teams and getting real clear about what it means, because I think that team up there probably has a team that it's responsible for. That team also needs clarity for its intent, maybe the organizational strategy, right? Maybe what they're allowed to spend and operate from. Maybe the decisions that they're allowed to make. Maybe how they have to perform. So there's a set of dynamic conversations that have to take place amongst multiple layers of teams. Good with me so far? So these are the pillars of empowered teams. Clarity on value and decision rights. So if I don't know what to do or is that a problem in any of y'all's teams? You think teams are operating, they don't have clarity? Is that a reason why you don't get what you want out of the teams? Right? They don't know what they're doing. Do you ever have the problem where we don't know who makes the decision? If a lot of people can say no, but nobody can say yes? Right? So it becomes really expensive. Competence. Do we ever have teams do things like, this to me is like a Scrum Master failure mode I see a lot of places. The Scrum Master is going to remove the impediments. But the impediments to the team are things in the DevSecOps group, or in my enterprise operating center, or in my architecture group, or in something with my customer or my market. Like, the Scrum Master can't go change those policies and impacts in the organization, right? So we're asking teams to do things they don't have the competency to do. And competency isn't a moral thing. Like, I'm not gonna ever be your accountant. You don't want me balancing your checkbook. I've demonstrated that many times, right? So I balance my checkbook now. And I love her and I trust her. So, and then capacity, balanced with demand. And then a cadence of measurement and feedback. So these are like the pillars. And really what I'm gonna walk through is each of these questions. If I were walking in as a manager and I was trying to assess with a team, what do we have to do to put these things in place? This is the avenue that I have the conversation. Worthwhile conversation for y'all? Okay. This is also the first time I've done this trimmed down version of it, so I'm trying to figure out if it's gonna take enough time or not. I think it's gonna fit in fine though. I think we're in good shape. So empowerment strategy number one, establish a team structure with stable teams and clear boundaries. We talk a lot about chartering teams, getting decision rights. How many of y'all have really, really well-chartered teams that understand their roles and responsibilities? So I need to hold this team accountable. I need to go and I need to tell them, here's how you're going to operate, or work together, collaborate. How are you going to operate so we can agree on it? Well, that's not acceptable to me. Well, that's not acceptable to me. Well, what is an acceptable thing to go? We don't charter teams and get this clear because sometimes it's hard work. And we don't want to end up in a disagreement as we just let it go unresolved, right? We don't have clarity on our roles and responsibilities. The decision rights one to me is a really big one, where a team wants to make certain decisions. I'm going to decide what's the most valuable thing to build in your job. We actually have a whole product group and a customer group. We're doing that up here. Well, how are we getting that decision clearly communicated to the team? So that breakdown is not between the backlog and the team that can do work against that backlog. It's in deciding which decisions get made up and down the stack. So one of the things I talk a lot about is different types of teams. Here we have delivery teams, product teams, portfolio teams, investment teams. That might be too complicated. You might need two. You might just need flat teams. But most delivery teams can't orchestrate their own dependencies. There's too many dependencies. They can't self-organize around them because they take more than a week or two to get in place. So I'm going to have a teaming structure that's responsible for orchestrating dependencies, identifying risks and removing risks around the teams for the areas the teams can't go after. Does that make sense? And that team's gonna have a charter. And that team's gonna have a charter that talks about what their roles and responsibilities are. And it's gonna be very, very clear what decisions they get to make. And it's gonna be shared between the delivery teams and the product teams, which decisions each team gets to make. Now, is it gonna be the same in every slice of the organization? No, there's some decisions that we're gonna push down to the work surface because the conditions exist and it's appropriate. There are some decisions around how we're gonna do something, how we're gonna decompose and break down the work and do things in the small that the delivery team's gonna get to. They're gonna self-organize around the constraints and the boundaries that were established and the negotiated agreements on the system. So when something's going wrong in an organization and teams are fighting, the first thing I'm walking in and going is, what was the decision that got made in the wrong time? How did they build something that you didn't want? Like, how did that happen, that they built something you didn't want? Who was responsible for sorting all that out? Because the problem is, it's the vagueness of the system. It's a lack of intentionality around the team design and who makes which decisions. This isn't super complicated. You write up the teams, you have a group, you get together and you talk about what are the decisions that each team gets to make, and you get agreement on it. This will be hard too, because you'll have people that don't want to give up some decision rights. We've been dealing with this actually here in town recently with a guy who's been running an IT group for 15 years with an out of control sort of stack of stuff above him. And so he doesn't trust giving any decision rights up. He wants to control what they're delivering to customers. And he wants to control how they're going to orchestrate stuff. The problem is that portfolio or product team tier where they're actually talking to customers, nobody has any idea what the status of anything is, when anything's going to get done. So he's not only making decisions, but he's not radiating any of the information. Is that problem, you guys familiar with that problem, that class of problem? All right, so how do we get past that? Sit your teams down, get extremely clear on what value means to that project or that team, what we're going to reward, what we're not. Get really, really clear on the roles and responsibilities that exist on the different teams and make it explicit which decisions get made at which tier. If you don't make it explicit, then things are getting dropped. Then you have to get better at making decisions. What does it mean to make decisions and communicate it? There's this whole sort of theory around commitment-based management. Have you guys ever seen any of that? Where I'm going to ask for something, you're going to make a promise, you're going to go do it, you're going to tell me when it's done. Like the process of managing the interaction between those teams becomes really important too. So if you're responsible for doing something, you're not just responsible for doing it, you're responsible for telling other people it's been done and making sure that you've negotiated explicitly the criteria. So what's cool about that from a value standpoint, acceptance criteria, OKRs, there's a whole bunch of things that are built into our Agile world that we can use for creating clarity on value. We can get clear on who negotiates the different aspects and what are the trade-offs, who gets to make the trade-offs. And then we can get the work down into the team so the team can operate there. We do a lot of OKRs in organizations. We've seen a lot of it going on, and they're not used to actually create clarity. They're not leveraged when we're actually making decisions. If y'all have seen a good OKR implementation, that's cool. We've seen a lot of places where it's disconnected from actually doing the day-to-day work. We're doing OKRs, but we don't have clarity. We see a lot of people that write acceptance criteria, but acceptance criteria are functional tests, not the problem we're solving. We don't communicate value and intent in our acceptance criteria. So when you say, well, OKRs, acceptance criteria, stories, well-formed teams, these things are all great. People go, we're doing all that. But you look at it and you go, but you have really clearly articulated goals and business outcomes communicated to the teams? Could they articulate why they're doing what they're doing and how they can associate that piece of work with that? If not, then you haven't accomplished the intent of your OKRs or however you're communicating it. Are there clear roles and responsibilities for all members? Yeah, but we don't really do them because the teams are different. And every team might be different. But if we don't know who's making which decision when and who's responsible for doing work and making it explicit, it's going to kind of fall apart. So if I'm a leader now, a manager, this is the tricky part. We have a low trust relationship between management and these teams already, right? And the teams don't want to be told how to go do this work. So what's the exercise of facilitating clear understanding around roles, decision rights, how we're going to do value? This is a leadership responsibility, right? You guys okay with this? We have to go in and we have to get super clear on it. And we have to do it with the teams, but we can't dictate it to the teams that we've rejected. So a big part of how we want to manage this is chartering teams explicitly, agreeing on our working, how we're going to work with acceptance criteria, OKRs, what it means to articulate value in a way that both groups agree to and can hold on to. Here's the other tricky part. It's easy to write it up once and just push it out. That isn't the right answer. Depending on the domain knowledge of the team you're working with, the complexity of the problem, the rate of movement, the number of dependencies, you might want to charter them differently. So you have to kind of thoughtfully go and lead this. But if I want to empower my teams, I have to create the conditions that I can delegate into the team, trust that's going to operate as we expect, make sure the team has everything necessary to be successful. Then we've got to get clarity on how all those things happen. Is that too much work? What are your thoughts so far on what I'm talking about? Useful, not useful? Well, you know, it isn't hard. It isn't hard. It takes courage. It takes tenacity. It takes intent. But one of the things that makes, yeah, there's a lot to it. And one of the things, because it's really simple, but it's hard. One of the things that makes it hard is this lack of trust between the groups. So you got to sit down and go, listen, we have to solve this problem together, and we're going to get as good as we can now. Do y'all do like monthly retrospectives at an organizational view, or just do team level retrospectives? Some organizations do operations reviews or bigger retrospectives. Yeah, so every once in a while, you should be revisiting the design of your teaming structure and decision rights and moving things around. When something goes really, really south, sit down and do it. You want to talk about empowering your teams? You want to start as a manager, set an example of empowering your teams? Talk to me about how we ought to solve these classes of problems to achieve the goals that we share. Now, the team is actually influencing its world. They're participating in how they want it to be shaped. And if you listen and help them put it in place and hold them accountable to the decisions they made, right? Because the system gets held accountable. That's empowering teams. It's building trust. So this is interesting because I believe leadership is responsible for the design of the system. And we tend to just let this stuff not be done, or we don't do it intentionally enough, and then we get messiness, and then we're frustrated, and positional power puts the frustration on the delivery team. I think if you are not getting what you want from your teams as a manager, you have failed to lead appropriately. You haven't created the conditions to be able to delegate into that team. Competence. The right people in the room at the right time making the right decisions. We see a lot of big, heavy SDLCs or process flows or diagrams about how to build software, how we ship product, how we work with, a lot of those things. Very, very little of it is really, really followed closely, and we don't have much transparency in the work that's actually going on in there. One of the cool things about the way that we can do with Agile is, y'all are pretty familiar with this delivery team Kanban, right? Here's what I'm doing the next 2 weeks, broken down into stories. We have clarity on it because we did that conversation. We're going to track it across through in progress, story done, whatever your flow is at that level. We're tracking those little pieces of work across. And we have a lot of transparency into the state of the work. We have a lot of transparency into where things are getting blocked. And when things are getting blocked, what does that mean? It means that we delegated something into a team that the competence didn't exist within the team to resolve it. Is competence moral? Like, should we be mad at them because we gave them something they're not competent to do? Should the teams that are interacting with each other get frustrated when we expected somebody to do something they're not able to do? That's a design of the system problem, isn't it? So what I want to do is make these flows be really explicit. We'll do stories at the bottom, features in the middle, epics at the top, maybe opportunities or investments, whatever you need, 1 or 2 or 3 stack. But getting extremely explicit that at this point, when we're in solution definition at the epic and feature level, here's the people that are in the room, here's the information they're going to have, and here's how we're going to make decisions that we can all hold ourselves accountable to, right? Within the design of the system. That's going to be reflected now in my acceptance criteria. It's going to balance off my OKRs, and it's going to be in the way I decompose my work. Because I have a stable team, and I have responsibilities for decisions. I've agreed on how we're going to operate. Now I can intentionally manage the flow of work. And when things aren't working, I can test for, did I have a poor team design? Did I understand who should make which decision? Or did I push work into a team they're not competent for? What do we do if we're trying to push work into a team they're not competent to do? What can we do? We can make it clearer. We can make it smaller, more precise. We can find another team that can do it. Or we can go in and invest in elevating the competence of the team. But if I give a team something to do as a product manager, a product owner, or an executive, or whatever, if I give a team something to do and they're not capable of doing it, is that the team's fault? So what is a team responsible for doing when we're having that conversation?
Communicate.
What's that?
Communicate.
Tell them what they can do. right? Yep, being transparent. Here's what I can do. Here's what I can't do. Here's what, if you could work with me to get these things in place, I could do this for you, but I can't handle that. But a lot of times, just because of the nature of the organization, we put stuff into the teams. We expect the teams to go do it, and they feel obligated to do it because of the positional power and stuff. So it's really interesting. It's the positional power thing that gets sideways, right? And it's because it becomes individual instead of understanding how the whole system works. So if I can get really explicit on how work flows, and I can tie what decisions get made where, who has to be in the room to make those decisions. And remember, I tied decisions to the different teams. We built it out earlier. I make sure people have the right information to make the right decisions. It becomes very interesting when, in many organizations, we walk out to the end point and we find a lot of the work at the end, we integrate at the end, we test at the end, we come up with our security requirements at the end, we solve a lot of things at the end because we didn't have the right people in the room at the right time, creating the right context for the teams to operate within. Or we delegated decisions about how we're going to operate into teams that don't have the right to make that decision. And then it conflicted with something we were trying to do from a higher level. So getting very explicit about the flow of value and the decisions and where they fit in, that becomes the critical next step. And then there's the capacity one. Every organization has more work to do than they can possibly get done in a period of time. That's just generally true, right? Are we getting things done faster when we're working on everything at the same time and are pushing everything into the teams? How do we have transparency in that? What do we do to understand how much capacity the team can handle? What's the optimal amount of rate based on their team structure and the competence of the team? How do you know when you're pushing in more stuff than you can pull out? This is, again, where a Kanban is a really nice sort of tool for understanding that. How do you know when the team is at maximum limit? Do you have an understanding of what the capacity of your teams are and how much you can push in? Do you know what the dependencies are that are blocking them? And are you orchestrating and managing the dependencies ahead of the teams or expecting them to figure it out in real time? So these are things we walk in and kind of look at, things that went really, really sideways. This is almost always like a big hit, right? But until I have the stable teams and cleared end decision rights and can actually measure the flow of value, it's really hard to actually solve for the capacity and demand conversation. It's really hard to get the dependency management decisions in the right place because I can't be finding every dependency late now and expecting the team to resolve it in real time. It just doesn't work. So I can design a system that has a lot of late failure and it will never be predictable. And if it's never predictable, I'm not going to trust it, right? So I'm not going to push decisions into a team that I can't trust. The one about capacity constraints and dependencies are two very, very big ones. Do y'all have good tools for understanding your capacity so that the business is making decisions and pushing things in that are balanced with your capacity? Are you good at, so I'm going to follow it up then. Are you good at managing dependencies ahead of the team? Are y'all good at really working on only the most important things? Why is it hard to empower your teams? Like given this sort of frame, if you were to look at it for a minute, what makes it hard for you to empower your teams as a leader? What's missing from this? Because a lot of y'all said it was hard to empower your teams. What makes it hard to empower your teams? Does this frame help you with that conversation? Is there things here that you could go do? What would you go do? Let me go to my last sort of big slide here. So the last one is just the cadence. And it's a cadence of management, the teams getting together and reviewing how is work performing. If it's hard to see the status of work and how work is performing or where the impediments are or how the thing is performing, it's very difficult to resolve. And if we're just managing like every individual crisis, a crisis at a time, instead of understanding the design of our organization, it's impossible to actually go improve. So we end up with talking about being in the system versus on the system. So we're working in the system all the time. But having some time to deeply understand how our system works, how our teams are working together, where their challenges are, where their impediments are, what their capacity is, what their competence is, and making sure that we've optimized for producing value through that, that transparency is really important. And we have to stop and go back and ask the questions, is the team designed right? Is the flow of decision making right? Do I have the right information to make the right decisions? Or am I just hacking on people? And when we don't have those things in place, then we end up just bullying on the teams, right? Because that's the only way to get things done. And we have to get things done. Trade-offs, just getting really, really clear in that moment. We want to do that fast, but we want to do it and it's going to end up eroding the technology and making things worse in the future. Or I can't do these 4 things, I can do these 2 things. Like having that cadence of using the data performance of the system in place, and providing that feedback so you can adapt and respond in real time. That's a critical strategy. Many organizations are still pushing things into the top they're not strategically aligned, they're not capacity constrained, they're not dependency aware, and just expecting it all to get figured out in the middle. Right? So all these pieces are in the messy middle there, that red X. To put these pieces in place, and part of that is having the transparency and then having an explicit place to make the trade-offs. Because if we don't make the trade-offs above the delivery teams, where are those trade-offs going to get made? Say I can only do 4 things, but you gave me 8 to do. If we don't decide the 4 as part of a process, who's going to decide which 4 get delivered? The team, or some developer, or some vendor, right? So that's an example of decisions getting pushed down because we're not taking accountability for it. So if I didn't get back what I wanted, I delegated the decision into a team that I shouldn't have delegated, or I delegated into a team that didn't have the competence to do it, right? So that has to be adjusted. So we're looking for, understand what trade-offs we have to make and how to make them. And the last one is just continuous improvement. How do we look at this system again and again and improve it? But what's interesting, all these things, you're sitting there going, if you're thinking, we already do all these things, and you're not getting your teams empowered, it's kind of the thread I was going down before. What's making it hard if you're already doing all these things to engage with your teams and make them feel empowered? Are you trying to make your teams feel empowered? Do you know which decisions you want to delegate into the team and give them responsibility for? Do you know which impacts on your system you want them to have a voice in and be able to improve and elevate so they feel like they're actually influencing their life? Because it's not just about organizing in chaos and crisis around the next piece of work, right? It's about actually making a place that isn't horrible to live in and horrible to work. It's about having the ability to participate in making it better and better for me to keep the promises that are being made between teams and between management and the team. So it's kind of the frame. So that's the takeaway is here. Empower teams, the 4 pillars, and sort of the interesting thought. And I thought I might have cut this a little bit short. I didn't go into too much detail on some of the areas. Be really happy to take any questions or work with y'all, take any specific and sort of walk through it, take any feedback on what I've presented.